Right. So we just said, like, it's so wild. The elementary school had a gas line break, and we're like, we've quarantined all the kids. I can just imagine the gas jokes we're gonna get later today. I can hear it from like my daughters already. Like, there was too much gas at the school, or something stupid like that. So we'll see what happens. For now, apparently everybody is safe, but I'll just be monitoring that. We'll see what happens. Apparently, construction crew hit a gas line. So, oops, right? Okay. Right. So anyway, we'll go to chapter 2. We'll see what happens if they call or text again. For now, it says like stay away. So but chapter 2, we'll start with this next chapter here, which will take us 2 days, just like the last one. Is we'll look at how do we study sexuality, some of the big sex researchers. So we'll talk about a couple of the big researchers in the field, some of the theories, though some of that I'm going to have you kind of look over a little bit more on your own. And then some problems and issues in sex research. So things related to studying sexuality and the different theories of sexuality will be our focus for the next day or 2. And psychology is all about theories, right? We have a theory for everything, right? All these different models and theories. And if you've taken another psych class, these models or theories are always covered, right? They're just kind of different ways of viewing a phenomenon. And in our class, we're looking at sexuality. So we can look at some different theories related to sexuality. And a theory is just a set of assumptions or principles or methods. It's a way of viewing something. It provides like an intellectual structure or a lens to view a phenomenon through. And so we can look at, what are the different things that might influence somebody's sexuality, that might influence the way that we view what caused their sexuality. And there's a bunch of these different theories, and they clash and they overlap. Some of them will say one thing and the other says something polar opposite. In psychology, if you ever want to sound brilliant, it's always the easy answer. It's a combination of all theories that leads to X. And you're probably right, like 99% of the time, right? It's just a combination of everything, right? We're not just one theory, but typically it's a whole bunch of them combined together. And I'll go through a couple of quick thoughts with these, but I want you to review these theories a little bit more in the textbook. And they start, I believe it's on page 28. So just make sure when you're doing your reading that you're kind of looking over these a little bit more. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because I want to spend more time focusing on the research element of it rather than this. But there's a bunch of these different perspectives, right? And so I'll go through them quickly, but again, spend a little bit more time kind of reviewing them. But these different theories try to describe what has maybe led to your sexuality or influenced it in some way. So the psychoanalytic theory is Freud's perspective. And we'll talk a little bit about Freud today, though he doesn't come up nearly as much in this class as maybe in other ones. But the psychoanalytic theory has a lot to do with like early childhood influences, your unconscious mind. Freud was very sexual in his theories, right? They're all about like the libido and sexuality, especially related to our parents, which makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. Looking at childhood sexuality toward your parents, that's not a popular topic, but he talked a lot about that and our libido and how that drives us through our lives. From a behavioral perspective, we could say that our sexuality is learned, right? Looking at conditioning, operant conditioning and classical conditioning, and how do we develop preferences based off of learning. Social learning theories look at how the environment plays a role. Right, so the environment can influence us quite a bit, how the people around us can play a role, along with some internal factors as well. From a cognitive perspective, we could talk about thinking, right? How do our expectations and thoughts around sexuality play a role, right? The schemas that we have, the experiences that we've had, and the thoughts and stereotypes that we built from them. Humanistic perspectives look a little bit at like relationships and the role that they have in our lives as far as wanting us to fulfill our potential. A lot of us at some point will form a long-term loving relationship, but it tends to give a lot of people a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. So looking at how do relationships maybe help push us toward our potential as a human being. From a biological perspective, we look at things like hormones and neurotransmitters and anatomy. We'll talk a lot more about those things when we get to chapters 5 and 6, looking at female anatomy and male anatomy and the things that influence gender. Evolutionary perspectives look at like trends in behavior, mate selection. Why is it that we choose the partners that we do? What drives us in order to perform certain behaviors? Those kind of very like evolutionary natural selection kind of ideas. From a sociological perspective, we can talk about sexuality as like social influences. How do we define certain concepts in our culture? Like, how does our culture define what is attractive or sexy for like a man or a woman, or maybe someone who doesn't identify as either, right? So looking at those social constructs. Feminist theories look a lot at like power dynamics, right? How do we decide on the different like constructs and dynamics of power in our culture? And queer theories look a lot at categories. How do we categorize people, right? So do people define themselves as gay or straight or bi or pan, or there's just a million different like orientations you can define yourself with. And each one of these different theories kind of views your sexuality through a different lens. And so again, in psychology, the best way to view this is just to view them as a combination, right? So if you combine them all together, it's probably going to capture the complexity of who you are. But again, make sure you review these on page, they start on page 28, it goes for a few pages, because I went through them very quickly, but it is something I might ask you about on that first exam. What I want to spend more of our time focusing on are the different people who have played a role in our sex research, right? And there's a couple of really big people, a bunch of like smaller contributions. In general, somebody who studies sexuality is called a sexologist, right? It's a great title, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? Sexologist, right? We don't have a lot of them, actually. It's a very, it's a field that has a lot of room for growth. But there aren't a lot of people who study sexuality, and they tend to be met with a lot of opposition and difficulty, right? It's not the easiest profession, but it's definitely very, very needed in order to discover and find out more and understand more. If we go back in time, in the 19th century or so, the first people to really study sexuality focused more on bizarre, dangerous, and unhealthy aspects of sex. Not what was the norm or what is like typical or average, but the early sexologists focused on the bizarre, dangerous, and kind of odd or unhealthy aspects. And it was something that was largely conducted by physicians, people who were doctors. So they were looking at it from a very medical perspective, a medical lens. And it was very problem-driven and fragmented, heavily influenced by politics and events of the time. People who defined themselves as a sexologist and started publishing journals or having meetings or starting organizations found themselves in jail, found themselves without jobs, shunned in their communities, right? They were really met with a lot of opposition. You were studying like dirty things that shouldn't be talked about, right? So the people who studied this early on, it really hit their careers pretty heavily. And a lot of them were heavily stigmatized as a result. Again, super important to study these things. It's just we weren't quite there yet in terms of accepting that research and that process. So as I said, there's lots and lots of different people. These are all like smaller contributions that I won't ask you about. The ones on the next slide are ones that I might ask you a little bit more about on like an exam or something like that. But these are some of the early people to contribute. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Freud, right? Sigmund Freud, probably like the hallmark psychologist, right? He's the one who's always holding a cigar. That's how you know it's him, right? And he's famous for saying sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, unless it was him, right? Like he was very hypocritical with his ideas of cigars, everything very like phallic and sexual in nature. But he was one of the very early sex researchers, proposing ideas like the libido, and again, some of the things I just mentioned a few moments ago, childhood sexuality and so on. Ewan Block is another one who started off early in the field, published the first journal related to sexuality. It was called the Journal of Sexology. And again, faced an incredible amount of opposition for this, and was what's the word I'm looking for? People attacked him on his way to his office, right? Just really violent opposition to publishing these kind of materials. Magnus Hirschfeld, another one, founded the first institute for sexology. So the first like organization to meet and talk about like sexual practices and sexual information. Richard von Krafft-Ebing wrote a book called Psychopathia Sexualis, which looks like it'd be wildly interesting, right? Like just from the cover, it looks like it'd be interesting. Very, very medical. It wasn't nearly as popular as I think he hoped it would be because it was so medical and a little bit dry. But wrote a very famous book looking at some sexual practices that were considered abnormal at the time. Havelock Ellis studied the psychology of sex. He wrote a book about that as well. These are all just people who kind of contributed in smaller ways. Clelia Mosher, not a lot of women early on in the field, but she was somebody who also started studying sexuality and gender as it related to differences between men and women. The people who I want you to know a little bit more about are these folks right here, because these are the people who contributed quite a bit more heavily in terms of the things that we're talking about and studying today. Starting with this guy at the top, and they mentioned him in the documentary last time, Alfred Kinsey, probably the most well-known and most influential sex researcher of the 20th century. And interestingly, he wasn't someone who studied sex, right? He was like a biologist and an entomologist by nature. And we're going to watch, it's about 26 minutes or so of a documentary on him in a moment. Really, really interesting guy. And he conducted a ton of research that was exceedingly flawed. Anyone who's taken statistics or any kind of like math statistics, the problem that he ran into is he asked so many people, like maybe too many people, and his samples that he took weren't very good. Right? Whenever you're doing research, you want to have what's called a random sample. So let's say I wanted to know how many people, how many partners the average college student has, how many sexual partners the average college student has. I couldn't just ask you, right? Because maybe something about like being in a human sexuality class makes you all different. And maybe like people who take 8:30 in the morning classes have less partners or more partners, I don't know. There'd be something maybe unique about this population, and it would be what we call a sample of convenience. It'd be convenient for me to ask all of you. Instead, I would want to ask like random people throughout the college, people who are online and in person, people who go to early classes and late classes, people from all over different disciplines, and so on. He mainly asked people in his classes, right? So he had a lot of issues with his research, but he was by far one of the most influential researchers in the field. I asked you about these two in that little quiz that we took, that little like for fun quiz that we took. William Masters and Virginia Johnson, very famous for studying sexual response. And there was a whole documentary or like a whole series that was made called The Masters of Sex on Showtime not that long ago, really interesting talking about them. But these two hooked hundreds of people up to different instruments and measured them as they were having sex. Now, I want you to think, would you be willing to volunteer for something like that, right? I'm going to have you, just casually, you two go ahead and have sex. We're going to hook you up. We're going to monitor, videotape you, and see how you respond. Issues with that takes a certain type of person to volunteer for something like that. I can't imagine being willing to do that, but a lot of people did. Hundreds of people did. And from that research, they were able to find out the different responses that bodies typically go through during any kind of sexual like interaction or arousal. And so just something interesting, I think, to think about in your mind, like what would you be comfortable volunteering for in terms of like sex research? Would you be comfortable answering questions on a survey? Most people usually, okay. Would you be comfortable maybe having somebody interview you and share those results with other people? Maybe it gets a little bit more like questionable. But again, a lot of people, no way would you go that far. But thankfully, a lot of people did, and we were able to get quite a bit of information from that. And then probably the best name you could hope for like a sex researcher, right? Evelyn Hooker probably, had a very difficult time with that, I'm sure, at many points in her life. But she challenged some of the views on homosexuality. That's what she's really well known for. She was one of the people who was instrumental in having homosexuality removed from the DSM. So it was no longer considered a mental illness in 1973, partly due to her work challenging some of those stereotypes and notions. So again, what I want to do is show you part of a film on Kinsey, and you don't need to take notes, just pay attention. But what I love about this is it gives you a little bit of information about his life and his past. And then it shows you this class that he developed. He was one of the first people, if not the first person, to teach a human sexuality class. And I think I mentioned this before, you had to be married in order to take this class. And so people like changed their wedding dates so that they could take it. They faked being married so they could take this class. Can you imagine like having to get married to be in this class today? And it's just a very, very different time. And I think you can see some of those mentalities as well. So let me bring this up here and I will play this for you. Again, it's about 20, it makes me laugh in my head. He would lend his car out to his students so they could have sex in it and then they would bring it back to him. Can you even, to me, that's always so funny to think like the whole thing, there's so many little things in there that are just so different, right? Like that people had no idea what these terms were or what it meant to be, gay versus straight versus parts of anatomy. I mean, it was just a completely different time, and his class, like he got in so much trouble for this class, and yet he kept doing it, right? He kept pushing those limits. He eventually stopped teaching as it gets to at the end here of what I showed you, and then he spent the rest of his time doing research. So he published several books on the things that he found out. And again, a lot of issues with his research, especially like statistically, but he asked his students, right? And I love that, right? Like if they stayed 2 hours, the boys picked up on that so they could ask, like, oh, you stayed 2 hours. I know what you've been up to. And so now I'm going to hit you up. But really like an interesting guy, really forwarded a lot of knowledge when it comes to sexuality. And as I said, probably the most influential researcher. So I think interesting to watch that. Hopefully you found it interesting too. I don't know, any like thoughts or comments or questions, anything related to that before I keep going? Okay. So a couple of other thoughts. Lots of ethical and sampling and issues with research and sexuality. And you're going to get a chance to kind of think about these a little bit more in an activity that we're going to do, but I just want to mention them here. Kinsey ran into a lot of these problems, as does pretty much anyone who studies sexuality, right? There's a lot of issues related to confidentiality and volunteer bias and validity and reliability, all these things that are kind of related to statistics and so on. But anytime that you do research, you have to have somebody who's willing to participate, and you have to get their consent. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if they got paid or not. Somebody should look it up. See if you can find Masters and Johnson. Did the research participants get paid? If you find out, let me know. But I'm not sure if they got paid or not. It's a great question. If anyone finds it, let me know, and you can share. So again, you have to have consent. You have to tell people what they're getting into, and this is really tricky with students. Again, I can't force you all to participate in research because you might feel like you have to as part of the class. And that was a tricky, like kind of a blurry line that Kinsey walked with his students. But you have to give people informed consent. They have to agree and know what they're getting into when they're participating in research. And you have to keep that information confidential, right? So he shared the stuff that he found out, but he wasn't like, oh, this student had sex with this many people, right? You have to keep it very like broad and generalized, rather than, sharing specifics. So you have to try and keep any information that you find out confidential. And as you can imagine, if that wasn't the case, you might hesitate to share information with somebody if you knew they were going to tell it to another person. See, a lot of you are looking. Anyone find it? I don't know. If you don't find it, I'll look later too. But if anyone finds it, again, let me know. Lots of sampling problems as well. I mentioned volunteer bias, right? It's really ideal to avoid samples of convenience, right? So again, if I wanted to know about, the average sexual behaviors of women, and I only ask prostitutes, I'm going to get a very skewed result. Like I'd want to ask prostitutes, but I'd also want to ask people who are celibate. I'm going to get a whole range. So you want to have a random sample rather than a volunteer bias in samples of convenience, which was again an issue that he ran into.
It says here that volunteers, volunteers in the beginning, so I'm pretty sure it's volunteers.
Yeah, I thought that it was because they volunteered to
Yeah.
participate, but sometimes as part of volunteering for research, you get a stipend or you get something. So interesting, yeah. So again, volunteering to be recorded and observed and videotaped definitely skews your results, right? You might have a certain population that are more likely to be willing to do that than others. Thank you for finding. Validity and reliability are also concerns. Very easy for people to lie. If somebody walked up to you, right? Not me, because we'll say like we're avoiding the sample of convenience, but if somebody was doing sexuality research and they walked up to you and wanted to ask you questions about your sexuality, you might not be honest, right? Or maybe you don't know, right? If someone asks you your orientation and you're not sure, right? Maybe your results aren't all that accurate. If they ask you how many partners you've had, how many sexual partners you had. How are they defining sex versus how are you defining sex, right? All of these things can be issues that cause problems, right? When was your first kiss? Well, how are we defining kiss, right? Like, how are we defining these things? That can lead to a lot of problems with validity and accuracy. And a lot of people are uncomfortable talking about their sexuality, so they lie, right? And that's something that Kinsey ran into quite a bit. And then consistency, right? Like, if, again, how are we defining terms? Are we getting the right information? When we ask 100 people the same question, are we asking it the same way? Is everybody defining those terms the same way? So we run into a lot of issues when it comes to sex research, and just research in general has to be set up really well in order to make conclusions from it. And I want to give you an opportunity to think about this a little bit more. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today and then a lot of time next time doing a little bit of like an activity related to sex research. You're all going to become sex researchers, sexologists. That's your new title for today and for next time. Yeah. So for Kinsey or what? So Kinsey was doing like, so in the 1930s, he was doing the class. So they said, what, 1936? And then he published some of those things. I believe it was like the 50s and 60s, right? So, and there's a wonderful movie about him as a side note. I want to say it's about 10 years old. It's called Kinsey. And the whole thing is about his life. I think it's Liam Nielsen, who's the star of it. He's not in Taken in this one. That's all I can think with him for whatever reason. But it's a great documentary or a movie about him rather than a documentary. Okay, so what I want you to do, I want you to find a group of people, and again, the same group that you've met with 4 different people, feel free to branch out if you want. But I want you to find like 3, 4, 5 people. So somewhere between 3 to 5 people, and maybe grab one piece of paper, put all your names on it, and then I'll tell you what I want you to do from there. So find a few people, maybe turn your desk. You're going to spend the rest of the time with them. Get a piece of paper, names on it, and then we'll go from there. Yes. Like 3 to 5, whatever's easy around you, but you want more than 2. Okay. All right, does everybody have a group? Okay, so as I mentioned a minute ago, we're all now sexologists. Get to study sexuality, but I want you to think about as a group, right? And I'll put this up here and I'm going to give you the rest of the time. Typically I assign this as homework, but I'm going to give you the time today to do this. So what I want you to do is as a group, if you could study anything, right? Anything related to sexuality, but try and think of something that you could actually do, right? So try and keep it more grounded in reality. Like we can't actually go out and measure people having sex, right? That's beyond our capability here for sure. But if you could study anything or find out anything related to sexuality, what would you want to know? Right. So as a group, what you might do for this first bullet is come up with some possible topics that you want to know about. Maybe it's something as simple as how did you meet your partner, right? Or how many sexual partners do you have? How often do you masturbate? Whatever. It could be anything related to sexuality. So as a group, I want you to come up with some possible topics that you would want to know more about. And then from there, I want you to try and narrow it down. What are some questions that would actually get at that like knowledge, right? So if you wanted to know, for example, how many sexual partners somebody has had, right? The average college student has had, then you might try and narrow that down, right? Think about how you would define like sexual partner, kind of build that out a little bit. And then we'll talk about the other two in a little bit, but let's just focus on the first one for now. As a group, come up with some possible topics that you would want to study or know more about, and what are some of the questions that might go with that. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit and then I'll check in with you. I'm going to wander around if you get stuck or have questions, but work on that first bullet for now.
Yeah. But the problem is like, it's still probably that it's a lie. I think really. Probably like. Yeah. Like 10 years. It's like those. Wait, what was the? I think. Before, this was line out perfectly.
Yeah.
You. I like that. People know after. Or like the other way down. Yeah. Yeah, don't. I want to be real. Yeah. So very general.
Yeah. Okay, so. And so this one. You know, like. And so. So let me follow you. So I have to say some fun. I love it.
So what I want you to do for the rest of the time is hopefully you've picked like one maybe 2 questions that you're most interested in. And I just want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about like any possible definitions you might need to have of them. Like some of you talked about like, what kind of toys are you using, or what do you think about in sexual partners? Like, how are you defining toy? How are you defining sexual partner? How are you defining these different things? Think about the way that you would phrase the question so that it's as clear as possible, and write those things down on your paper, right? Like if you want to know, how many partners you've had, how are you defining partner? And just kind of think about that a little bit. And then I want you to think a little bit about this second bullet here. What are some other like demographic pieces of information you might want to know? Like, do you want to know, to be able to compare like men versus women, or people who identify as certain ways versus another, someone who's in a relationship versus not in a relationship? Someone who's certain ages versus other ages? Do you want to know differences between like, I'm just keep thinking of yours, like what kind of sex toys do you use, right? Do you care if they're younger versus older? Maybe those answers are different for somebody who's in a relationship versus not in a relationship. So I want you to kind of think about your question a little bit more and make sure you kind of refine the questions you'd want to ask. And then what are some demographics you might want to gather, whether that's age, orientation, religious background, maybe that is something you're interested in, any of those kind of things, and get those thoughts down. I'll keep wandering around, but work on that from here.
Oops, I'm talking. No. So we
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That was like. Oh, okay, yeah. I don't know.
Is there anyone? Seems like you're more interested. Great. Stop.